Okay, here's where we left off on our last video. So this is the fourth video. Make sure you're doing them in order. So we were working on this tree right here. And so this is our wet and to dry techniques. So the thing that we have left is putting a top on this tree. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is mixing your colors, right? It's really, really tempting to just use the color straight out of the pan, but everything looks better if you mix it at least a little bit. Okay, so I have my green. I'm gonna make sure I have enough for what I need to do, and then I'm gonna go pick any other color, any color to put in there. So I want this to be nice and bright, so I think I'm gonna do just a little bit of yellow, trying not to contaminate my paint too much. And this is a student set, and so it's a little bit dirtier than I would keep mine normally. So I'm gonna have some other colors kind of mixed and ready to go in a similar family of colors to work into that. So this is going to be wet into wet, but also with a little wet into dry over the top. Okay, so I'm also going to hydrate some of my other colors a little bit so that they're ready to go, because I'm going to touch into a little bit of brown and some other colors to make this naturalistic. I always do a teeny bit of orange just to neutralize, because it's going to make it look more natural. So you see how quickly that changed with just a touch of orange. Everything you do in watercolor, you want to be a little bit mixed with your colors. So I have my little tree right here, and I'm going to just paint the leaf mask now. Okay, also my background has blue in it, so a little bit of blue is going to mix into the paint that I'm using. Now I have a really wet, heavily loaded brush, and I'm getting down my base mask for my leaves. See how much water's moving around in there? So that is going to be rehydrating some of the blue, and so I want to keep that in mind. It's also going to help some of those brown branches kind of mix in and integrate. Okay, so I'm going to blot my brush a little to get some of the water and the paint off, and then I'm going to use it to lift some of the water back off. So it almost works like a little vacuum. We're going to pull some of that water off because I don't want it that sopping wet. So I'm going to blot that back off my brush. Then I'm going to get into here to some of this yellow green that I mixed, and I'm going to start incorporating that in on the light side. So now I'm doing some wet into wet techniques on top of the wet into dry that I already did. Okay, so I'm dabbing some yellow in there. I'm going to go in with some more vibrant green and see how it just blends out and mixes. It's because everything is still wet. And so I can just kind of tap that around. Okay, and trees look most realistic if you have a nice little range of lights and darks. So I'm doing a tiny bit of brown, which is a really strong color. So I'm going to rinse my brush out, and then I'm going to go back and move it around a little bit to just soften it up. And just like we did on the last one, we can get in here with a little bit of blue to imply some shading, and I don't want to get too much. I don't want it to get away from me, so it's just a little bit of blue. I'm going to mix some of it into my green over here, so I can just kind of tap that in so it looks very natural. Okay, this is a good place to practice a little more grass if you want to do a little more grass, because it will look really pretty. I'm going to put a little bit of green up high. I feel like this yellow area is too solid. Okay, so we're just going to let that do its thing and dry. And so I could come down here and I can tip my brush so that it has a nice smooth tip on it, and go in here and do a little bit of grass just to make everything look like a generic tree in a grassy field. I'm using a couple different shades, just like we did on the last video, to show some texture. So there's a little yellow green in there. There's a little regular green. Okay, the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna mess around a little bit with this area where we took our tape off. So I want to do clouds, and clouds are one of those things that people are always pretty excited about. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna mix up a nice neutral grayish tone by picking an assortment of my dark colors. So I'll do a little red, a little purple, teeny bit of blue, and a little bit of orange to neutralize this, because I want to make a nice natural looking gray. Okay, I never use black, I always mix my own. Okay, so I'm going to come into these clouds that I made, and the first thing I'm going to do is, with clean water, I'm going to get my cloud area damp with clean water. So this is going to be a wet into wet technique that we're doing to make these clouds look really soft and natural. So I'm getting in there because I want to do just a little dark shading into these. Okay, so this wet into wet is going to be with a really fine tipped brush. I'm going to get in here, soak up a bunch of that gray that I just made, and the first thing I'm going to do is run a line along the bottom, and then I'm going to just tap, tap, tap. So wet into wet is great for anything you want to have really soft edges. Okay, and I painted it with clear water first so that it would dissolve and spread around. Okay, so this is a nice like cloud for more of a sunny day. So here's how it looks if I don't do the water first. See how I have that hard line edge? So I'm going to rinse my brush and with clean water come along that edge to make it fade. Okay, so just subtle shading to do those edges. Now I could get really dramatic and go with a lot darker color so that it looks more stormy, right? The darker tones you get in there, the more it's going to look like storm clouds instead of white, fluffy, you know, pretty sunny day clouds. I'm going to make sure that my shading goes all the way to the edge of that opening. Okay. And so that's a fun thing about tape, is that you have these clean areas that then you can come back in and paint in. Okay. All right, and I can go down here and be like, oh, here's my cheesy little hills. And because I'm going quick and not testing my colors, they're ending up lighter than I want them to be, right? But I can be like, there's my hills, okay? Also, the faster you pick up the brush, the more flicks you get. And so you always want to be watching that you're not picking the brush up too quickly, because you make little spots that flick to other places in your painting. Okay, so just be aware of what you're doing with your brush and how fast you're lifting it. Okay, next thing we're going to go over and do is we are going to, with clean water, not this one, I'm going to get clean water, clean fresh water. I'm going to come over here and paint this wet into wet area so it is damp. Okay, I'm going to do that with clear water to let it soak in, because I really want the effects to show. Now, if you're doing wet into wet, you can do wet into wet in color paint, or you can do wet into wet into just plain water that's damp. So while that's soaking in, I'm going to do my glazing. Now, glazing is intended to create effects that you can't do otherwise with watercolor because it's naturally very transparent. So I have my glazing. I'm going to go over the top of these three completely dry areas, like dry from yesterday, so that we can see the colors you can get from glazing that you can't get in watercolor any other way. So see how you have so much more color intensity doing that? So here we are doing it with colors that are different, very different than the ones we started with glazing. And then we're gonna try it with colors that are the same. So for glazing, I work straight out of the pan because I'm going for super, super saturated. So before I put it on there, I'm gonna test my color on scratch paper. That's pretty vibrant. And then I'm gonna come over here and do this right over the top. And the point of glazing is to try and not mix the colors, but to let them stack on top of each other so that you can see how vibrant they are. All right, so I did it with a green, and now I'm gonna go back and do it with purple straight out of the pan. Okay, so here, coming into purple, I'm gonna test that on my scratch paper. That's really intense purple. So I'm gonna do this right over the top here so we can see the effect it creates. One of the things people complain about regularly is they can't get the colors as intense and vibrant as they want them to be. And the way to do that is with glazing, okay? Glazing also gives you a nice little speckle effect sometimes, which you can see in the lighter colors. You can also use it to soften up the edges on things you've painted before. So see, this purple was kind of light. It has a softer edge, right? Where this darker purple we did over the top maintains its edge a little bit more. So anytime you're painting watercolor over other watercolor, it rehydrates the paint that you put down and mixes it in just a little. Okay, so I have my wet into wet right here. It's had a few minutes to soak, so I'm gonna re-wet it with clean water again, just because I want it nice and hydrated, because I'm getting that sponge of the paper really nice and soaking. So you can see there's no shine on it. So I'm gonna go back and add just a skim a layer over the top so that I have just a little bit of a shine. And I did the first layer so that it would soak through into the paper, and the second layer so I have standing paint on top. Now here's what happens with wet into wet that is one of the reasons I use it a lot, okay? So look at this beautiful, soft, blurry edge you can get. You can also mix colors together really nicely, and it gives you beautiful effects and soft shapes. And that is going to show a lot of streaking right now, but as it dries, it's going to dissolve into it. The other thing it does is it lets the pigments that are in the paint that make that paint show, it lets those pigments separate on the paper. And so you can end up with really kind of unexpected effects that way. The other thing that you can do is you can dot other colors into the colors that you already have. So let's say I want to get in here with a little bit of green. It just is gonna softly diffuse that color into the other colors that you're using. And so it gives you a soft edge, a really soft connection point between those things. And so this is nice for like underwater effects, anything you want to blend really well, for making things like fire. All of those turn out really nicely. It also gives you the opportunity to blend paint on the paper. So I'm putting more blues into this. And so you can see you can do a lot of things that end up really soft and pretty because the paper is wet enough to let the watercolor move around. So I think I'm gonna dab a little more purple down here to balance some of the intensity of that purple. Just so that it feels a little more even. So you can see really soft and beautiful effects that you can create with wet into wet. And I use wet into wet all the time when I'm doing watercolor. Gives it almost this like soft, ephemeral, misty quality that I find to be very appealing in watercolor. It's one of my favorite things about watercolor. So make sure that you try that and see how it looks and how much fun it is. And the other thing, while this is wet still, I can come back and pull in some of my other skills, salt, alcohol, other things on top if I want to do that. And it's going to make it really, really have a lot of interesting texture. And so these are interesting techniques separately, but putting them all together can produce really fun effects. And so same thing with this tree. When this is dry, I can come over here and glaze more leaf shapes on top of it. I can glaze on top of this and then put salt into it and do things like that. And so that's a good thing to practice with some of these gradients over here. I can get in here with these and experiment. Sorry, I'm at school, so I have my school keys rustling around. So once you are done with everything else, I'd come over here and play around with some of your wet into wet brush strokes. I'm going to do a color gradient on these. You can see that water moves back. I can vacuum it, so I'm using all these skills that I've picked up that are new. So my brush tip gradient. Ooh, that brush is loaded. Okay, so vacuum that water off. While that's wet, I can come in here with some of my other things and combine stuff together to get a lot of different effects, so I can see how it's going to look. And so get over here and try some different things together. Get in there with your salt, your alcohol, whatever you think would be fun, and create some more effects so that you can see how things look. So here's some alcohol I can get on top. And I'm even going to spatter so that it does different things. And so try all those together and see what different effects that you can make on some of your washes. Okay, come in here with a little bit of wet into wet because that's still damp. Oh, just kidding, that one's dry now. Oh, so some of those green edges are still damp. And so take a minute and experiment on the back of your paper and see what cool things you can do, and let it dry. Okay, so those are some watercolor basics so that you know how to use a bunch of different tools and get a bunch of different effects. And so happy painting.